Hi there. I am the Flying Historian, and on the 11th of February 2023, I released a video titled P-51D vs. P-47. Is the Museum of Flight correct? In said video, I discussed a talking point, which I heard many times over the very brief period where I was looking to become a docent at that very museum. Very basically, the argument presented within the World War II gallery is that the P-47 is the unsung hero of the Second World War, and is superior in almost every regard to the more well-known P-51, specifically the P-51D. If you haven't seen that video, I recommend pausing this one to go and watch it now. This is all fine and dandy, Mr. Historian, if that is even your real name. I literally said my name at the start of the video. But why are you revisiting this topic? Who are you? Is it because you have come to correct yourself and finally admit that the P-47 is in fact the best plane of World War II? How did you get into my house? Or maybe it's because you were hit by the 40-some-odd monkey wrenches and have come to the far superior opinion that the P-38 Lightning, or F-4U Corsair, is actually the superior aircraft. Why are you in higher resolution than I am? Or maybe it's because you now know what the government has been hiding from us all this time. The web of lies set forth by a cabal of ego-driven generals who scheme to destroy the P-47 and kill Americans for their own twisted game. Well, that was a lot, but to answer all your questions, yes, I have come back to this topic because of ideas such as the ones you mentioned. It seemed like the conclusion of my last video didn't quite stick, so I am back to clarify my thesis and answer some of the questions I found in the comments. The many, many questions. Go on. Before I lose those of you who have the attention span of a squirrel, let's go over what I concluded in my last video. There is a difference between what is on paper and what happened, what occurred and what theoretically could occur. The difference is made clear when looked at through a lens of historical analysis. History not only can produce data, but also contextualizes that data so that it can be more effectively used. Using historical analysis, one can arrive at a reasonable conclusion for a question. For our example, the question is which World War II fighter, the P-51D or the P-47, was best. Raw data differs from this way of looking at a period, because it is often a jumble of fun facts and memorized figures, all of which could be missing vital pieces of information, which could explain why it is the way it is. For our purposes, historical analysis is important because it can more accurately guide us toward an answer within the realm of reality, rather than spouting facts and figures. Get to the point. Yeah, I don't care about your fancy words. I want to hear you admit that you were wrong. Very basically, in the last video, I wanted to convey that arguments based upon hypotheticals can lead to a slippery slope, and often aren't very productive. You can extrapolate evidence based in reality to hypothesize what could have occurred. However, you will always be short of the actual truth of the matter, countered still by arguments formed in the but what if category. They are only ever going to be as good as the next schmuck who tries to answer the same question. Now, if there were factors which interfered with how some event or series of events occurred, then the historical record will show as much, and we may use that to explain how certain events played out, or why data looks the way it is. Even with this knowledge, however, it is still not enough evidence to point to any definite conclusion about a set of events that just did not occur. Most importantly, I concluded that, based on the historical evidence present, it is most accurate to say that both the P-51 and the P-47 had a 50-50 split responsibility for ending the war in Europe. Wrong. What?
Yeah, totally unfounded.
Hey, I bet this guy got all his info from Tic Tac, or whatever them kids are using nowadays. Well, if you just wait, I will explain myself. That's the whole point of this video. So today, let's talk about these two. Again, I'm gonna make this quick. In this video, I will be tackling a lot of the arguments made in the comments section of my last video. It took a long while to compile all of the comments and then group them into themes. Now I tried to make each theme's comment its own, though some comments were just too specific. If you happen to think you found a comment which is featured in this video, do not harass that person. Please be respectful. Don't be a d- I didn't really talk about the argument made by the museum much in the last video, but there are certainly things that are important to cover. The argument is flawed in many ways, not least of which is that they tried to compare an entire series of airplanes with just one variant from a series of another. This is like taking the career of the current best baseball player and comparing him with the collective careers of every baseball player in the Baseball Hall of Fame. The argument presented has a European bias, that is, almost all the data used is entirely from the European theater of war, not the whole war. I didn't harp on the argument too much last video, but after thinking about it and doing research for this video, I do want to give it a bit of pushback. Whether it is the intent of the argument or not, when presented by those who are looked at as experts, it is important to understand what you are talking about and how you talk about it. To have an all-in-good fun conversation is plenty fine, but in context, that is not the way it is perceived. Many take it as a teaching moment. Unfortunately, what I have found makes their conclusion lacking in evidence at best and being entirely misleading at worst. You are just butthurt that you lost. Your precious P-51 is actually garbage. Watch Greg's videos! Many seemed to misunderstand my standpoint in the last episode. I will clarify here. I love the P-51D. It is my favorite. But it is my favorite irrespective of my stance on war, machines of war, and the history of the aircraft. I can separate my childlike love for the P-51 from my scholarly professionalism in a quest for seeking understanding and truth. In the video, I held no bias toward either aircraft. Equal treatment and time was given to both. The conclusion of that video stated that neither plane could be considered best because the premise of the argument was flawed, and the history showed that they were unequal from the start, but both worked hard to achieve almost equal status during their careers.
See? He is saying that if my P-51 is as bad as you say, your P-47 is just as equally bad.
Why, I oughta... No, this isn't what I said. Let's get to the comments. Ask yourself this. Would the US have been better served if they only had P-51s, or only P-47s? Looked at this way, the P-47 is the clear winner. Well, I suppose, but Erich Hartmann had 352 kills. Imagine if he had flown in the P-47. He'd have over 500. Okay, but he didn't, and probably wouldn't. Corsair versus Mustang. In the soccer war, the Corsairs won. The soccer war? You mean the war in, like, the late 1960s? Americans didn't even fly in that. And this isn't a battle between the two physically. Who was the highest scoring ace of World War II? That's right. It was Richard Bong. And what did he fly, Tiffany? That's right. Senior quarterback P-38. Nuff said. Well, the two highest scoring aces did indeed fly the P-38 Lightning. They both flew in the Pacific, where the P-38 did not have as many issues and were in far greater numbers than in Europe. Again, historical context is important. Ignoring that this has nothing to do with the conversation, let's explore this string of reasoning for a second. Going entirely off this idea would yield that the P-38 is the superior aircraft, but if one were to use data from Europe, they would find that the P-38, although having some role during the conflict, was almost entirely ineffectual on the end results. It would then be fair, using the logic explained, to say that the P-38 Lightning is good if given to outliers and under very specific circumstances, but cannot compare with other World War II fighters. If one uses historical context to contextualize all available data, the true answer is much more complex, yields actionable results, if the war was still happening, I suppose, and would conclude that the answer to our question is undecided due to a lack of data, and the fact that the question isn't super useful to have the answer to anyways. Nuh-uh, you aren't going anywhere yet. Let's run with this idea of testing which is the best based on number of aces for a second. I used this source on the top P-47 and P-51 aces in the European theater to conduct this survey. It's like the first result on Google if you want to check it out yourself. As you can see, some of the slots aren't filled, and some of the kills are off. I went ahead and looked at every pilot listed, yes, all 57 of them, and adjusted for kills and who flew what. For the top 10, 7 were P-47 pilots, and 3 are P-51 pilots. Although, 3rd, 4th, and 5th places are all held by the 3 P-51s in the top 10 list, meaning that in the top 5, it's 2 to 3, with Mustangs taking the lead. Hold on now, you are skewing the facts. I argue that there are more P-47 pilots in the top 10 than P-51s. I'd counter that there are more P-51 aces overall than P-47 pilots. So external factors may be at play regarding the prevalence of P-47 aces in the top 10 list, just like there are external factors explaining why there are no P-38 pilots, despite the P-38 holding claim to the top scoring aces of the entire war. Moving on. Of the 57 top aces used for this data pool, 21 of them flew the P-47, 35 of them flew the P-51, and 1 of them flew both but achieved about a 50-50 split for their victories in both aircraft, so I counted that one person for both planes. This gives us a total ace ratio between them of 2 to 3, or a 40-60 split, around. This is all in favor of the Mustangs. Evidence shows that this small pull tracks with the greater trend of all American aces in the European theater, and so we can assume our conclusion using this data. This is just for air kills, however, so with the P-47 doing a lot of heavy lifting in the air-to-ground role, I, and many other historians, would say that the participation and effect on the outcome of the war in Europe between both aircraft is roughly 50-50. I'd give 10% more kills, which is to say denial of the enemy to use valuable resources, to the P-47 for its ground attack work. What is my conclusion from all of this? It's the same as it was in the last video. It doesn't matter which one is better, both proved, historically, to be near equal assets to the US's and the world's interests in ending the war in Europe. You might even say that the first hypothetical is just wrong. We would be 50% screwed either way.
The true measure of a warplane is what happens when the war is over. You need to see which ones they kept. See which countries used them after the war.
Sure, I guess, but you aren't gonna like the answer. The P-51 would indeed roll into service as the F-51 and go on to fight in the Korean War, the Chinese Civil War, and a few other places. As many commenters pointed out, the F-51 also saw combat as late as 1969 during the Soccer War, where El Salvador took on Honduras.
See? Told ya.
Though,
now hold on.
The F-47 also continued serving with the now U.S. Air Force and other U.S. military branches up until the 1950s, as well as serving in other nations. The F-47 stayed in active service with the 14th Fighter Group until 1947, when they exchanged them for the F-84 Thunderjet. The National Guard forces used them until 1953. RAF P-47Ds fought in Indonesia, France used them in Algeria, Chinese nationalists used them against the Reds, and rebel forces in the Dominican Republic used them during the uprising in 1965. Its combat record post-World War II is certainly smaller than that of the F-51. The F-47 did join its younger sister into the new age of jets. Not so smug now, are ya? I agree, Barden. This clearly means that the F-4 Phantom II is the best fighter plane of all time. The GOAT. Best hands-down fighter, no exceptions. Are you serious? Look, the F-4 Phantom II was an excellent fighter, as well as a multi-role aircraft in some ways. It was more than capable of standing up against the foes that it faced in the air during the Cold War, but just because the F-4 Phantom II is still technically in service with a handful of countries, including Iran and Japan, does not mean that the F-4 Phantom II has stood the test of time and is just too good to be kicked out of service. That's just not the case. There are aircraft nowadays that are superior to the F-4 Phantom II. So why are these other F-4s still being used? Probably because they're just what they have. It's expensive replacing entire air forces with new planes. It's expensive training new pilots. It's expensive just maintaining those new planes. It could just be the fact that these are the planes they have, and they don't really have the money to replace them. So just because a plane continues past its, expiration date, I guess you could call it, does not mean it is just too good to die. To be clear, those who say that it is important to see that the F-51 went on to fight in places like Korea are weak arguments. Because not only are they wrong, the F-47 also went on to fight in certain conflicts, but the argument is just kinda silly. The Mustang unit cost was only 2/3 that of the Thunderbolt, and only half that of the P-38. Well, that is partially true. The 2/3 cost of a Thunderbolt is simplified, but I guess close enough. The Mustang unit cost in 1943 was $50,000 to $51,000, which is equivalent to $902,820.71. This is January 2023 numbers. The unit cost for a P-47D-40RA 1945 built Thunderbolt was around $84,897, which is equivalent to $1,426,889.63. Again, January 2023 numbers. Conclusion? Inflation is a bitch. But no, for reals. We won't have to look at the unit cost for the P-38 because the argument here has some problems, and knowing that number won't be beneficial. In the cases where I did see this argument get used, it was often in the "it's simple economics, Reddit bro" way. If you have no idea what I just said, I don't blame you. What I mean is that it was said in a matter-of-fact kind of way, while not going on to explain their point. I don't know what they were trying to argue here, other than pointing out that the Mustang was cheaper to produce than the Thunderbolt. So, what is your point?
I didn't comment that.
Okay, how about you? I'll assume your point is that the Mustang was cheaper, and that's why they made more of them, which may explain their prevalence, or that they were cheaper, and that's why the USAAF used them over the Thunderbolt when they entered service more broadly. If these are the arguments they were trying to make, several issues arise. First off, it was World War II. The idea that something had a price tag to the US did not necessarily matter. If it worked, and it wasn't too much of a burden, then they sent it through. Second, if the Mustang was so cheap that the USAAF weren't afraid to lose them, then why did they send P-47s on the more deadly ground attack mission, especially in Europe, where AA weaponry was more prevalent? Thirdly, for those of you on Team Thunderbolt, oh, that's me! Wouldn't the argument that the P-47 was too expensive go counter to what you were trying to argue for? That the P-47 was the superior plane, and could do this, that, and the other better than the P-51? I mean, price in this case would be a factor since you're bringing it up. But here's the kicker. Why, if the P-47 was such a burden on old Uncle Sam's pockets, did Uncle Sam go ham on buying so many of them? By most accounts, less than or just a bit over 15,000 P-51s were produced. The numbers I found ranged from 14,000 to 15,500 produced. A lot of the times, I could exclude a few hundred because I'm not going to be including the H variant, who did not see any combat. In contrast, approximately 15,683 P-47s were built by the end of the war, potentially 1,000 more than that of the P-51. As finding exact numbers on how many P-51s were produced was a bit challenging, let's assume that some estimates are right, and a little over 15,000 P-51s were made. By these most estimates, that over is in the hundreds, not the thousands. So liberally, we are saying that equal numbers of P-51s were produced as P-47s. To be clear, that's after giving the P-51 both the benefit of the doubt and going counter to most academic sources, which state that the P-47 was the most produced US fighter of the war. We can go a little further with this and look at how the USAAF didn't even really care about the early P-51 project. They were like a parent in 2008 at the dinner table, looking at their lives slowly draining away, all while you have the P-51 kid running around without a care in the world. The USAAF saw the P-51 as a foreign project, not something they really had to concern themselves with. Plus, the vast majority of their budget at the time was all focused on upgrading their existing fleet of P-40s, P-38s, and the new P-47s.
So, the government just spent money like it typically does?
Sorta, but I think my point is, cost was not a factor in whether one plane was chosen over the other. The more expensive planes saw more production models built, and to counter the idea that the cheaper Mustang was used more often can be debunked with a quick Google search. Thunderbolts flew over 500,000 combat sorties from March 1943 to August 1945. Potentially, the P-51s flew 213,878 combat sorties. That's less than half the number that the Thunderbolts went on. It seems the price tag of these planes did not affect commanders' decisions to send them on combat sorties.
If I was in the war, I would want to fly the thing that gets me back alive.
Yeah, one lucky shot from the enemy could down a 51 with its liquid-cooled engine and all. Of the top aces who flew 47s, all of them made it home. Yeah, these are all valid points. I've won? I've won! Oh, did you hear that? I just won a debate on the interwebs, Ma. No. Sit. We still have a lot to cover. Let's take a peek at the hard numbers. Around 2,500 P-51s were lost in combat. If we assume that 14,000 were produced, that means 17.86% of them were lost. For 15,000, it's 16.6%. If it's 15,500, then it's 16.13%. 5,222 P-47s were lost. 3,499 were lost in combat, and 1,723 were lost in accidents not related to combat. That leaves us with a total of 33.23% lost altogether and 22.31% lost in combat. Technically, this means that a higher percentage of P-47s were lost in combat during World War II than P-51s. Though, this might have to do with mission type and number of sorties flown, and not that one plane is better than the other. I have read in some places that during World War II, being shot down meant that you were 2/3 likely to be wounded or killed. I was not able to find a definition for lost in the cases where I did find exact numbers, so I don't know whether these are aircraft who failed to return to base, or a combination of those that failed to return to base and planes that returned beyond repair. If it's the latter, then the P-47 still probably got the pilot back safely to fly another day, compared with the P-51. The number you'll often see is that the P-47 held a 0.7% fail to RTB per combat sortie record, and that's an impressive feat. For those that said it only takes a lucky shot to shoot down a P-51, or that the P-51 could be taken down by a rifle, a little dramatic in my opinion, but it isn't entirely untrue. If the coolant line was severed, then the likelihood of coming home was slim. The aircraft certainly did not have much in terms of armor like the P-47. As a quick side note, the A-36, the ground attack version using the early P-51 model, would serve from the summer of 1943 to the winter of 1944. Many would come home with damage that often couldn't be repaired, and by March 1944, there was a quick phase-out. Groups either replaced them with new Mustangs or the P-47. The P-47 had its troubles too, though. Pilots who had been flying Spitfires were not happy about their switch. Some believed the plane to be too chunky to fly. A little mean, but okay. The first operation using P-47Cs in Europe occurred on the 10th of March 1943, when the 4th Fighter Group tried to do a fighter sweep over France, but their communication systems failed, meaning their mission was essentially over before it even began. The P-47 had teething issues, which took some time to patch out. It also had difficulty fighting at lower altitudes, where German and Japanese planes flew best. A lot of the early issues with the P-47's effectiveness came from a lack of combat-experienced American pilots just seeing the war for the first time, or learning how to fight in an entirely new machine. Those who flew in Spitfires and Hurricanes before the P-47 were stepping into a whole new way of dogfighting. It took until the late summer of 1943 for Americans to learn how best to deal with their adversaries, but after that, the P-47 certainly was deadly. Combined combat experience with extra armor protection, and the P-47 made mistakes forgivable, since they didn't result in the pilot dying as often. Some time back, I read a book about the experiences of Luftwaffe pilots in World War II.
You read a book? Now that's the hardest pill to swallow yet.
Will you shut up? Anyway, the statement made by German pilots was that the Thunderbolt broke the back of the Luftwaffe, and the Mustang finished it off. The quote, which many have attributed to a mystery German ace, or book from days long past, is not from a German ace, and it may have been from a book from ye olden days, but I never saw the quote correctly stated. The quote is from Major General William E. Kepner of the 8th Air Force Fighter Command. He wrote, quote, "If it can be said that the P-38s struck the Luftwaffe in its vitals, and the P-51s gave the coup de grace, it was the Thunderbolt that broke its back." Now, I do have a few things to say about this quote, but honestly, that could turn into a whole video, so I'll just say this. The quote is somewhat of a throwaway. Kepner's opinion on fighters when it came to long-range escorts is all over the place, and typically said neutrally, as in he didn't seem to care. Long-range escort and destruction of the Luftwaffe are intrinsically connected, as we will discuss later, so him saying this, probably at or after the end of the war, is more for show and reflection rather than actual analysis. This can also be seen at the very start of the quote. If it can be said that the P-38 struck the Luftwaffe in its vitals, I don't know what he's talking about here, because the P-38s might have been useful in Europe, but their history is bumpy there, and their overall effect at the start of the war was very little. The whole quote just seems flashy rather than factual. I did find quotes from actual German aces and other pilots, mostly on the P-47. There was this maybe real quote: "The P-47 wasn't so bad because we could outturn and outclimb it initially. The P-51 was something else. It could do everything we could do and do it much better. First off, it was hard to recognize. Unless you saw it from the side, it looked like an Me-109. This caused us trouble from the outset. We would see them, think they were ours, and then the damn things would shoot us full of holes. We didn't like them at all." Nothing in the quote strikes me as incorrect or anything, it's just that I found it on some sketchy website, so yeah. Then there are these quotes which I am far more confident in. The P-47 was the best fighter bomber of the war. The P-47 Thunderbolt was exceptionally fast in a dive, but could be outdistanced at the start of the dive by an Me-109G. It would absorb many cannon hits. I can testify to that. As a fighter bomber, it was very efficient. It also possessed a long endurance. The P-47 would absorb many cannon hits and still keep flying. These quotes don't say much beyond what we have already discussed, or will discuss, but I decided to include them just so people have actual quotes now. Now, I can't forget about the good old Goring quote, which I did see in the comments section of my video, as well as all over the darn place. Here's the quote which I see as most likely to be accurate, as I wasn't able to find the German quote, if he even responded in German. When asked by US intelligence at what time did he believe that the Luftwaffe had lost the war, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring stated, "When I saw your bombers over Berlin, protected by your long-range fighter," presumably the Mustang, "I knew then that the Luftwaffe would be unable to stop your bombers. Our weapons plants would be destroyed. Our defeat was inevitable." Just like Major General Kepner's quote, I don't really regard this as being anything other than flashy. It is a very quotable quote, as per the hundreds of different iterations of the same quote I read while doing research for this video. Göring's history as chief of the Luftwaffe yields a semi-intelligent man willing to say and do anything for a little whiny man-child as long as he held his position of power. I think Göring here was saying what he believed to be the answer the Americans wanted to hear, instead of explaining the complexities of a later war-struggling Nazi empire crumbling on both sides. As we will see, this idea of the death of the Luftwaffe was far more complicated than what a single quote can explain. Finally, I saw some commenters trying to argue their points by using the point of view of other pilots. All I have to say to this is that, in my experience of reading many different pilot memoirs from different time periods, all of them will say that their plane is the best plane. P-38 pilots and F-4 Phantom pilots both say the exact same thing about their planes. It's a culture thing for fighter pilots. I wouldn't really take it too seriously. When the P-47 was flying, the Luftwaffe had more experienced pilots flying, plus more aircraft. The P-47 dealt with them before the Mustangs arrived, and therefore the 51s had it easy. Yes, the participation trophy argument. I saw this one a few times, and I've got to say, it is unique. Of course, it is valid to say that pilots with less training do not fare well when faced against pilots with more training. This is seen towards the end of World War II in both theaters. What is unique about this argument presented is that it's almost formulated as an insult. I don't think I have ever heard someone claim that their experience in one war was far worse than another's experience, especially when both of them came from the same war. Yeah, but we are arguing about which plane is better. If the Mustang had it easy, then clearly that means the Thunderbolt is superior, because it managed to go toe-to-toe with the best of the best. Do you have any sources to back up that claim? Boy, this is the internet. I don't need no sources. I can say whatever I know is true, and all the real intellectuals know that the indestructible, super-maneuverable, sound barrier-breaking, just the right amount of guns-toting, all-American underdog patriot fighter that is the B-47 is the best of the best. Right. Well, what about what we discussed at the start of the video? That both planes were equally important to the war effort in Europe? Not true. The P-47 was the best of both worlds. It gave just as much love to ground targets as it did to air targets, and it killed a bunch of baddies. Your 50-50 split sounds like a bunch of nonsense. Well, I don't like doing this, but I guess it's time to go back to the numbers. The P-47 achieved a kill ratio of 4.6 to 1, and in the European theater, the P-47 destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft, with more than half of those being air-to-air kills.
Oh, this is gonna be good.
In the European theater alone, the Mustang shot down 4,950 enemy aircraft and destroyed another 4,131 of them on the ground. More aircraft than any other American fighter can claim in the European theater. The Mustang's effectiveness was made clear early on in their careers. The 4th Fighter Group had gotten 75 kills in P-47s from March 1943 to February 1944. By mid-March 1944, they had scored their 400th kill while flying P-51s.
See? The P-51 is a beast. Way better than your P-47.
Don't get ahead of yourself now. We haven't gotten to the real meat of this convo yet. The history. Prior to America even arriving, the Brits had held their own over the skies of the English Channel and their own homes against some of the best the Luftwaffe had to offer. Ace legends on both sides died during the Battle of Britain. Sure, there were some big-name German aces around when the P-47 came about, but that was the case for the Mustangs too. If the argument that the P-47 fought with only the biggest and the meanest of Germany's air force, that would mean that almost all of the Luftwaffe was experienced pilots when at their strongest and in their most numerous state. This I am willing to give to you as the potential reality of the situation. You must also assume then that in the long while between the P-47's starting operations and the P-51 being added, all the operations which the Luftwaffe had been going on, where P-47s were not present, were not creating experienced pilots, and in doing so, creating the quote-unquote easy environment for the P-51. If that isn't the case, and more experienced pilots were joining the ranks, this would mean that because the P-47 didn't end the whole Luftwaffe by the time the P-51 arrived, equal numbers of experienced pilots would be faced as the P-47 had. Further, you would be omitting the fact that air supremacy over continental Europe had yet to be achieved by the start of 1944. Layman's terms, the P-47 didn't do its job. There's more to that, and we'll go over it later. So let's say that the P-47 did get all the big-named aces. Since they have less kills, that would mean that after killing all of the aces, they couldn't kill the regulars? Or is it that they only killed aces? That's not true, so it must be that they killed some aces and some regulars. But that would still mean that the P-51s scored more aces and more regulars, or vice versa, so on and so forth. P-51s are credited with killing aces. That much cannot be denied. But they were also forced to face score after score of inexperienced as well as experienced pilots. Any body they could throw into an airplane, some commenters pointed out. That seems more impressive on the part of the P-51 to me. The ability to go toe-to-toe with anything and anybody in the sky, even when it's unrelenting waves of fighters, as seen in early 1944. This argument is strange, because maybe the P-47 got a chance early on to fight more air-to-air, fighter-to-fighter combat-experienced Germans, but Germans attacking bombers were experienced too, just in a different way. Plus, it's silly to think that all the planes the P-47 were facing early on were ace material. Regardless, these men still risked their lives, and some did it in a plane that offered less protection and less stopping power for a short period, but they still managed to outkill the killers. If you want to throw your hands up and say that's unfair, since all the Germans were over Germany, where the P-47 couldn't or wasn't allowed to go, and don't worry, we'll get to that, then I would say that you're starting to get the point. Life and history are not fair. That is why this argument is better had as something silly. But if you want to turn it into an actual historical debate, then know that the rules of the game won't be equal. It is why I said that the P-47 would probably win over the P-51 if this was some sort of card game. But in the context of rapidly changing doctrine, tactics, and strategy, all based around the reality of what was going on, you must judge these aircraft on their effectiveness, and all that information and its context is present, not hypothetical. Well, still, all those fighters in 1944 and all, they were all inexperienced. Killing them is easy. It's like putting a shotgun in a barrel full of fish.
Yeah, but the job still needed to get done. And in 1944 and 1945, the P-51 was the one to do it.
Yeah, well, the P-47 could have done it too if those greedy generals weren't so stuck on their ideas that the bombers could go off and do things on their own. Then the P-47s would have had their fuel tanks. And then they could have flown all the way to Berlin and back, just like the P-51 is claimed to be the only fighter in World War II to have done. It's just silly. Clearly there's a winner, but everybody just wants to kick their feet and keep with the plane that they think is the best. Both of you have points, and I completely agree, although I'm very tired and still kind of confused about how you got into my house. So, after we reorganize everything, let's tackle... Or we could just fight right now, for dominance. Like real men.
Yeah, okay.
No, please, no!